We are recording, right? Thank you,
Yes.
Ed. And
Yes.
hello to all those who are listening on the recording as well. Okay, we were looking at some of the issues between Jews and non-Jews, and we started with a historical background with a review of some of the literature, and there were some concerns that were raised that in some ways the relationship has changed, and there are some concerns that in Israel there has begun some in some places denigration of non-Jews as not being equal human beings to Jews, and that was clearly not what the tradition intended. We saw that. We started talking a little about some of the issues of ritual roles. Well, brought up for Jews and non-Jews within the synagogue. We talked about opening the ark, which, interestingly enough, while on one level did not have a specific requirement that it only be done by Jews. I think we saw the sources also look at other sources other concerns outside of the traditional halacha, that it just was one of the things that, even though it did not specifically say in some of the sources it was only for Jews, that we did not feel comfortable with that because the other roles within the synagogue that require Jews, such as aliyot, leading services, are restricted in traditional synagogues to Jews. Now we are going to go to an issue that has been raised in recent years, and it's an interesting issue, which is the question of synagogue membership. Now, note, the classical sources in the Middle Ages and the Talmudic period are not going to have rules about who can be a member of a synagogue, right? Okay. They certainly will have rules about tzedakah and paying your dues to the synagogue and what you are should obligatorily, what your obligations are to the community. But it was not, the synagogues were not constituted the way they are nonprofit organizations with memberships and boards of trustees and all sorts of things that we just take for granted. But that's a relatively modern invention, right? Uh, you didn't have the type of organization in ancient times, so we're not going to find this in the codes. You'll find this in synagogue constitutions, organizational constitutions, and the question has been raised, and let's be very direct, it's because of increasing numbers of intermarriage. So can non-Jews not only question can they open the ark or have an aliyah, but what dues category do they fit in? And not only what dues category do they fit in, what responsibilities do they have within those categories, right? We lived in a time where the assumption was, I mean, it was one of those, what they call the klutz kasher, a crazy question. What do you mean? Well, a non-Jew wanting to join a synagogue, that was unheard of, right? How would that even possibly happen? Why would you even ask such a ridiculous question? But nowadays, you have questions. You have very specifically, of course, intermarried families come to the synagogue, raise their children as Jews. The children become bar bat mitzvah. So, on the one hand, we have a legal question as to both Jewish and secular law. The other question, people sometimes raise the issue of, well, if they're taking advantage, if they're using the services provided by the synagogue, should they be paying proportionally as everyone else is? I.e., if it's a couple and they come to services and the kids in the Hebrew school, is that a single membership? Is that a family membership? If it's a family membership, well, if you're a member of the synagogue, doesn't that mean you can be on a committee, on the board of trustees, vote when the synagogue has an election of some sort, not only for officers, but on policy? Can a non-Jew be the president of sisterhood, men's club, officer of the synagogue? Okay. So those are the types of questions we're going to be seeing that are raised. Now, I'm going to take a look at some articles that have been written recently. By the way, let me just throw that out. What do you think? Non-Jewish family, an intermarried family, one Jew and non-Jew. Should they have membership, restricted membership, family membership, single membership? What do you think is the best policy for a synagogue to have?
I have a quick question before you
Sure,
answer that
please.
question. What
Sure.
about a single parent with children? Do they pay family membership?
No, no. My understanding in most synagogues, correct me if I'm wrong, some of you have been on synagogue boards and have been in positions of that the dues for a quote single person is approximately half the dues of a family membership. Is that a generalized assumption we can make about synagogues? Single person, a single parent has a child in a religious school, a single parent doesn't have a child in a religious school, usually the dues structure is set up. Let's assume that a single person pays about half the dues of a family, and again we can make that. Let's make that assumption. Is that a safe assumption? I think it's a safe assumption. Okay. So what do you think? What should be the policy? Diane, what do you think?
Oh, that's a very slippery slope, Rabbi. So, first of all, as a single parent of children, I suspect someone who is married to a non-Jew is not going to want to classify themselves as a single parent, first of all. Um, if their spouse is supportive and comes to either synagogue or events or social events, um, I've seen it in many synagogues in my life handled so differently. So, what happens when their child gets bar mitzvah and the parents want to go up and give a blessing to their children? I've seen where the non Jewish parent is allowed on the bima, but not in a religious capacity. They're allowed to give a blessing in English. Um, of course, each synagogue has their own protocol. Some synagogues depends on how much the family donates. So, it's a very slippery slope from what I've seen in my life.
Okay, it is a slippery slope, but the synagogue as an institution needs to have a policy to determine to say to this couple, okay, this is your dues, and it's based upon the fact that we classify you as what? And Diane's pointing out, maybe it's not such an easy question. Any other comments on this?
Yeah, as
Yes.
I think that what should happen is the intermarried couple comes in, and if the child is Jewish, you know, then they should be charged the membership of what a single equivalent, the same one as a single parent.
Okay, you would say that let call them a single parent.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else suggest any
But
possibilities?
then who's determining if the child is Jewish?
Well,
Is
Well,
the
okay. Let's say it's a conservative synagogue. We have clear rules. The child is Jewish if the mother is Jewish. If the mother was not Jewish, then the child, let's assume, has been converted in some way, right? Children can be converted. So let's assume it's two parents. One parent is Jewish, one parent is not, but the child definitely is. That situation.
I
but
have
if
a
the child is in
question.
Hebrew school, they haven't been bar mitzvahed yet, so therefore they couldn't have been converted. But that's another conversation.
by
I
the
have a
way,
question.
No, no,
How,
no. If the child could be in Hebrew school after conversion, and even in some cases, they might find a situation where a synagogue would say, "Okay, child isn't officially Jewish, but you want to start him in the Hebrew school, that's fine, but you have to have a conversion at some point." Okay, so those are possibilities too. There are lots of stuff could be going on here. Carol, what do you think?
my question is, how common is this? I don't see it. I didn't see it in the Phelan Jewish Center or in the shul I'm belonging to now, that the non-Jewish parent is coming on a regular basis. I've
Mhm.
seen Jewish fathers come with children on a regular basis, or a Jewish mother, but not the father who's non-Jewish. I don't know how
Mhm.
common this is.
Oh, okay. This is an interesting question. I will say this. It is more common in places outside of the Northeast. Why? There are fewer Jews, a lot more intermarriage, a lot more intermarriage, a lot more conversion. Such was the case that I knew of in Nashville. By the way, if that's the criteria, should a synagogue allow two Jews, one of whom says, well, I come to the synagogue a lot, but my spouse never comes to the synagogue, so charge me as a single person.
No,
I wouldn't allow that.
no.
You don't think synagogues get that question? Believe me, they do. Okay, so you can't allow that. But if that person who's not attending the synagogue is not Jewish, then it's clearer. But if the person who is not attending the synagogue is Jewish, then it's another situation. Any
Right.
other comments before we look at some sources? Yeah, Rini.
Well, I know of one family in our synagogue where the wife is not Jewish. I know she comes to shul because I see her, but she's very active in helping. For example, every year we assemble Purim bags for the entire congregation, and she chairs that committee, and it's a lot of work.
Here's someone who's chair. So here's the question. Chairing a committee within the, now, is that a sisterhood or a synagogue role?
No, it's a synagogue role.
Okay, because you might say it might be different for a sisterhood as opposed to a synagogue.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I
Okay,
think
this is a clear chairperson of a synagogue committee who is not Jewish. Is that person a member of the synagogue?
that I don't know. I just wrote to our executive director to find out because I meant to ask that question about membership last week and I forgot to ask them. But her son is super active in the shul. He leads services. He must have been converted at some point. And he leads services and he's, he and his dad are active. But so is she. But I don't know her membership status.
Okay. The question, okay, Diane, and then Carol.
Oh, well, so my opinion is that it doesn't matter if your spouse goes to synagogue or not. I think the fee structure is based on how many people in the family are available to help pay for the bill, not how many times a year do you go to synagogue. But, I grew up in a conservative synagogue where women couldn't even be on the bima to be a temple president. So we've obviously come a long way. Now, you could be a temple president without ever having an aliyah, I suppose, if you're not Jewish. It's not a requirement of being a temple president,
Okay.
is it? Right?
Well, that's an interesting. You
Well-
raised two questions. If the criteria for choosing between single and family membership is the fact how many people are in the family who might be able to help to pay the dues, then Jewish or non-Jewish status might not be any effect a care we wouldn't care about. So one of them is not Jewish, but they got two people, they can afford to pay the dues. They got two incomes, they should pay a full family membership, right? You could make that argument. Carol.
I would think that if the non-Jewish member comes on a regular basis, I would consider them members and charge them as a family and
Okay.
allow them to participate in non-religious activities. In other words, if they want to serve on a committee that's not religious in its activities, I would allow that if they're coming on a regular basis. Sort of an
Okay.
ancillary membership.
That's a not a great criteria to how you prove or disprove it. Or you could also argue, so you are creating an incentive for not coming to services because it's cheaper. Okay, Ed.
Look at a broader spectrum. I mean, we have what, 310 family members?
Okay.
And what is that? Maybe 500 adults that could, they're single.
Wow.
How many come on a regular basis to Shabbat service? 70.
That's right.
So
So you're going to argue that your dues should be proportional to your participation.
no, I'm not going to argue that. I'm saying has nothing to do with your participation.
Okay.
Remember, you pay full dues.
Okay. Okay.
Otherwise, you charge them $1,000 a ticket for the high holy days, and it all comes out even.
Oh, okay. We're noticing there are some really interesting questions here. There's this larger question, which I just will throw out. How are we, as a synagogue, showing that we want people to be in our community even people who are intermarried? And how do we send, what's the message we send to families who are intermarried about whether or not our synagogue is going to be a place where they're going to feel comfortable and welcome? That's a larger question, which may be laid out by how you set up your dues structure. Okay, so let's take a look at let's take a look at Realia. Okay, one last comment, Rini.
I'm not sure, from the people that I know in our shul, to young women who have converted recently. And I'm not sure it has anything to do with the due structure. I think they just, for personal reasons, for their husbands, they decide they've come to shul and been very welcome, and they decided they wanted to be Jewish. I don't think it had anything to do with paying more dues or fewer dues.
Okay.
And they come all the time, and they decided they wanted to be Jewish. And one made sure she converted before her daughter was born. She was pregnant. She said, this way you'll get two for the price of one. So they really wanted to convert. So I don't think it had anything to do with Jews.
Okay, so let's
Not
think
an
of
issue.
the best of their intentions, and that the due structure may be irrelevant in terms of people's sense of whether they want to join or not. Okay, so let's take a look at some, and this is fairly recent realia. Okay, let me get the oh, come on, where are they? Okay. Okay, everybody got the share?
Yes.
You can all see the article, right? Okay. This is an article that that appeared. One second, I'm trying to get everybody. Oops, I'm having a little trouble with my there we go. Okay. This is an article that appeared just March 2017. That's already 9 years ago. And some of us may not even be aware of this. And it says, this is by the Jewish Telegraphic Association, the news service for the Jewish world. Conservative synagogues pass proposal allowing non-Jews as members. Hey, anybody aware of that? Does this sound surprising? Okay. The umbrella body for, by the way, they want to take a stock picture of an interfaith ceremony. I have to, I'm very visual about this. And how do we know this is an interfaith ceremony?
See two clergies.
He's
Well,
not
no.
wearing a kippah and she's wearing a hat. So
She's wearing a hat and he's not wearing a kippah. Well, maybe it's a Reform congregation. I don't know how we know this is does one of them look non-Jewish? I don't know. It's kind of a funny picture.
You see two clergies.
Two clergy. I see one clergy there. There's a rabbi.
One clergy.
Yeah, but there's another one next to it somewhere.
I don't see him. Maybe he's out of, but I'm just pointing out that kind of a funny picture, I thought, if you're trying to illustrate an intermarriage. Okay. All right. Here we go. 9 years ago, mind you, the umbrella body for conservative synagogues approved a resolution to allow individual congregations to decide whether to grant membership to non-Jews. So it's up to the congregation, okay? March 2000, with vote of 94-8, with one abstention and 15 members did not vote. Okay. We celebrate, this is an official statement. We celebrate our diversity. So it was set up a commission. They wanted to figure out what's the best way to do this. Now, is this done because of conceptual issues of welcoming to non-Jews? Or was this done because we need the money?
It's the money, and I think that what they did is they're afraid to make their own decision, so they pass it down the chain.
Rather than have okay. Again, you can argue: is this we celebrate diversity by letting all the congregations make their own decision, or as you suggest, well, this is such a hot issue. We don't want to take a full stand as the organization. You can a lot of these decisions you can read in a variety of ways. Now, they do point out that the movement prohibits rabbis from attending. Well, actually, we'll see. This is an interesting question, which we're going to see a bit later. As of 9 years ago, yes, the rule was that a conservative rabbi could not even attend, not to mention could not officiate at an intermarriage. Although we'll see that has changed. Okay. Now here's another article. Conservative welcome non-Jews, but will they be second-class citizens in the synagogue? That's an interesting question. Okay. In other words, okay, we'll take your money, but you get all the privileges of membership. How do you work that out? So this is an article that appeared shortly after. This is March. This was around the same time. Yeah, about a week or two later. I mean, and they're trying to make themselves pretend that they're Chagall, and they come up with this interesting looking artwork. Okay, all right. So they talk about a real couple. Okay, so let's take what does this feel like for a real couple? Think about that. Think about someone who was raised in the conservative movement. They marry someone who is not Jewish. Are they going to want to join a conservative synagogue or not? Or are they going to just say, oh, we're intermarried, therefore the place we need to go is a Reform congregation? I think part of the reason that resolution was passed was to make that statement that just because you're intermarried, don't discount being part of a conservative synagogue. Because I think the general, nobody passed a resolution on this one, but the general feeling for many intermarried couples was, all right, we head to the Reform congregation if we're going to join one. And I think that's one of the reasons that they won't say this out loud, but I think that's part of the mindset. So this is about someone who she is an Italian Catholic, okay? And she was, she married a Jew, a priest and a rabbi officiated, right? The priest blessed the first child, rabbi gave her a Hebrew name. But joining a synagogue like the husband who grew up it was impossible. That's because he was raised in a conservative movement. And the synagogues aren't allowed to have non-Jewish members like his wife, who was raised as a Catholic. Okay. So prior to 1967, the general rule was if an intermarried couple joined a synagogue, it would have to be a single membership, and that the non-Jew was clearly not a member. Whether or not they wanted to come to services, whether or not they did come to services, irrelevant, just a blanket rule, which would then make the non-Jewish member of the family feel this is not my place. Okay. It was hard to leave the conservative movement, but he made the decision so that we could have a whole family. We felt that we had no place to turn but to the Reform movement. Now, her family can technically join a conservative synagogue, but they still won't do it. Okay, so the resolution was passed. And now at the time, Steve Wernick, he no longer is. At that time, he was the head of the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. Since then, someone else has that position. For us, it was a simple question. How do you deepen the sense of welcome for those married to people of another faith or no faith? So notice what he's saying. It's not a question of the dues. It's not a question of the finances. It's not a question of whether you come to synagogue or not. The question is just the question of welcome. You want to send a message of welcome, and that's the reason mainly for making the decision. Non-Jews still can't serve on synagogue board. They aren't allowed the honor of praying over or handling the Torah scrolls. Okay, they can't have an aliyah. Okay. And rabbis still can't officiate at the intermarriages. So the movement is saying this was done primarily to send out a message that intermarried couples could join a conservative synagogue. Okay. Create a friendly.
Can you bring me a hot tea?
I'm sorry? Is that a comment?
No.
We distinguish between being a member of a family and being part of the Jewish covenant. Does that make sense? Does that work? In other words, okay, you're part of our group, but not fully. Yeah. Rini?
Well, I wrote to our executive director and he wrote right back. And he said that in our shul, a non-Jew cannot be a member of the synagogue.
Okay. Now that's the Princeton Jewish Center, which, by
That's
the way, it's at this point, I know this has changed over the years. It is affiliated. Is it affiliated
Yes.
nationally with any movement?
Yeah, conservative.
So it is affiliated in the United Synagogue.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah,
And-
it is conservative. Yeah,
Okay, because at one point I think there was some sort of sense that was kind of in between.
you're right. A long time ago, it wasn't affiliated with anything, but
Okay.
now it is conservative. And it says he wrote me, I believe our bylaws say that members need to be of the Jewish faith. We do welcome interfaith families, which I know is true, but only the Jewish member is the member.
Okay, but notice too that they've also formally or informally allowed a non-Jew to be the head of a committee.
Yes. Now, I don't know if it's formally or but she does all the work. So
Right. Okay, yes. I've been, yes. Yes, I have known of committees, committee chair people who just kind of do nothing and the vice chair does all the, I've been there. So,
but I've worked with her. So she
Okay.
and this other woman do it together and they work very hard.
but probably in that synagogue, there's no formal indication that this is the limitations of the participation of the non-Jewish person.
Well, she's not on the board or anything.
Okay.
This is just a one-time, once a year that I
Can-
know of that she's heavily involved. But
Can that person be in charge of the committee to elect a rabbi?
no, of course not. We have a special committee to select a rabbi. It has to be members. So that
Okay.
means they have to be Jewish. Yeah.
Right. So we see that here's a situation where we're trying to sort of straddle two lines, right? We welcome you on one level. Now, that may mean you're officially a member, or might mean you're not officially a member. We welcome you, and there's certain things you can do, but there's still certain things you can't do, right? Now, what we're seeing already, for some people, that's okay, right? Okay. On the other hand, and I have literally spoken to people like this, when that sort of distinction is made between a welcome but also a lack of ability to do other things, they have said to me, well, I'm sorry, I'm going someplace else. Either I'm a member or I'm not, right? Diane?
So a couple of things about this. Is this still the case where it says not only can a rabbi not officiate, but now they're tracking a rabbi's personal life as far as what personal family or friend weddings he or she is allowed to attend? Is that what this is saying?
Okay, why I might want to defer to something later. I'll answer that question.
Okay, but I have a question. Oh, sorry. My question about this though is I don't recall ever in my life joining any conservative synagogue wherever I've lived and having any questionnaire as to if I or a spouse at the time was or wasn't Jewish. Now,
Okay.
different, for example, when my adult son started at Schechter, there was a physical interview where they wanted to know about the grandparents' Judaism before they accepted him. Now, that may have changed today also, but I've never experienced that at any synagogue.
Okay, you're asking two interesting questions. Question one. So what happens in a rabbi's family when a close relative is going to be intermarried? And the rabbi says, oh, I can't officiate. Can I even attend? Here's what's the reality? The reality was up until a few years ago, yeah, you weren't supposed to, but colleagues did. I mean, the unofficial word was the RA was not enforcing the ban on attendance at weddings of Jew and a non-Jew. Okay. Several years ago, and we'll take a look at this a little later, the Rabbinical Assembly officially changed its rules. So the rules of the Rabbinical Assembly now are that we can't officiate, but we can attend. They realize that there's a reality, and many rabbis were not following that rule anyway. That was the first question. The second question you raised is really quite an interesting question, because this is where it comes down to. For example, you mentioned the Solomon Schechter School. So someone says, I sent my child to a Solomon Schechter school, so they should be all around Jews, and I want them to associate with Jews, and I want them to marry a Jew. And now what happens? He goes to a Solomon Schechter school, and there's this person who's not a Jew, and they wind up getting married. And why did they send my kid to the Solomon Schechter school, right? Okay, so you see, that's a reality. Let's make it worse. Why not? I have been involved in rewriting membership applications for synagogues. So, since we know that intermarriage is quite common, how, in a sensitive way that doesn't turn people off, do you, excuse me, and I've seen this done different ways. Let me get another Ludens, and then we'll continue. 1 second. There we go. How, in a sensitive way that doesn't turn people off, do you say on your application to join a synagogue, you get the name, you get the address, you get the phone number, and you get the 16 different email addresses and the cell phone and everything else. And then do you say, hey, by the way, are you Jewish? Do you have, I am Jewish, Jewish by choice, not Jewish? Do you have some other subtle or unsubtle way that accomplishes two goals? One, a clear indication of the status of this person, that this person does not feel some way rejected by. And I have had serious discussions and objections to things that I have written on membership applications, because those are two, to some people, diametrically opposed ideas. Oh, I want to join the synagogue. Great, just fill out this form. Well, what do you mean you're asking about whether I'm a Jew and if I converted, if I have the evidence? What's that? And I've had other people say, oh, of course you have to ask that. Of course I converted. I want you to know that I'm not, So while I don't know if there's a great answer to this question, by the way. Right? I can't say that the sensitivities of 100% of the people can be satisfied, because the synagogue does need to know the status of the person who is joining this. We all agree with that, right? The synagogue needs to know whether this person who is approaching, who wants to be a member, is, and the members of their family are or are not Jews, right? I think let's start with that assumption. So how do you with the sensitivity, ascertain that on a piece of paper that's a form in front of you? Now, some people will say just checking off Jew, non-Jew, Jew by choice, that's fine. And I've had people, when I've put that in applications, say that's insensitive. So, Diane, you're asking a good question. And I would say, I would agree with the Solomon Schechter School's position. Yeah, you want to be very clear about this. There are people, and even more and more nowadays, who are patriarchal Jews. I was doing a wedding one day in Nashville, and this was a second wedding, I think, on both sides. Not a young person. But the bride had grown up in a Reform congregation. Her father was Jewish, her mother was not. I and many of my conservative colleagues have had to sit down with a prospective person who's, in a relationship and wants you, the rabbi, because you're the rabbi, they really want you to do the wedding, and have had to say to them, oh, by our standard, you're not Jewish, would you mind going? And this person has been Jewish their entire life, right? They went to a Reformed synagogue, they went to religious school, they became bar mitzvah, they went through confirmation, they were active at Hillel, da, 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 da. And then I'm going to say this to this person. There's a problem. So this is the complicated issue nowadays. By the way, in that case, I said, just let's go to the mikveh and we'll be finished. And she said, fine, no problem. Felt so good. I was so worried. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
you read the book, Angela Buckdahl's book.
Yeah.
Because that was her problem.
Well, and you see, she and her sister reacted totally differently.
That's right. That's right. But that was her big obstruction.
Well, that's yeah,
Accepted.
right. Here's Angela Buckdahl, as you may know, is the rabbi of Central Synagogue in Manhattan. She may be one of the most well-known rabbis in America, and she is a patriarchal Jew, and as is her sister, and both of them went through the same educational process. And when the issue was, gee, you're not a Jew because you weren't formally converted, the sister got really upset and said, okay, goodbye. And Angela Buckdahl spoke to Rabbi Elliot Dorff. Some of you may know that name. And they had a nice, quiet conversation. And they went to the mikvah. And it was, that was just, okay. So everyone reacts differently. That's a question so I know this is a bit of a discourse here from the main topic, but that it's a question. How do you find out? How do you know? You have to have a rule of some sort. How do you do it with sensitivity, with inclusivity? Sorry about that. And do that. All right. Okay. Let's talk about this couple. So Wernick said, the movement tried to balance the need to create a friendly atmosphere for intermarried people and non-Jewish spouses with the need to maintain the distinction. Right? Because these are two, here are our countervailing forces. We're welcoming, but we make a distinction. You're in or you're out at some level and at some point. But we want you around, even if you're in or you're out. So how do you do that? Okay. So that was his answers. We distinguish between being a member of a family and being a part of the Jewish covenant. Again, everyone's going to, I think as I've said, I've met people who've reacted in entirely opposite ways to that type of statement. Okay. Okay, one big reason the movement has changed, the conservative movement has changed. We ordained women as rabbis and LGBTQ rabbis in 2006, right? And within the movement, I talk for myself and my colleagues, the ban on performing intermarriages is one that I would say the vast majority of our colleagues support. But I will say in the conservative movement, there are some voices who are questioning that, okay? And of course, the movement has declined for various reasons. Okay. And the new resolution will not, if the resolution was intended to increase membership in the movement, will that do so? In other words, here's a third factor. We want to be welcoming. We want to maintain standards. But you know what? We really need members. And so is this resolution, which, by the way, almost none of you ever even heard of, right? So you can imagine, if you guys haven't heard of it, how many intermarried families are aware of this, right? And you are the more involved people in the movement because you're sitting here in my class, right? So if the intention was to move people into membership, well, the article is suggesting that there are those who are saying it's not going to work. There's still more work to be done, said Karen McGinnity, director of Hebrew Colleges. Hebrew College is a college in Boston. for Jewish studies that also ordains rabbis. Indeed, where the mood will almost certainly fail to make a difference with a non-Jewish mother, right? So when you have a non-Jewish mother, it's one step to normalizing intermarried affairs within the movement. Also, Seymour. Do any of you know Seymour Rosenblum, rabbi in Philadelphia? Yeah, I know Seymour. He, as a conservative rabbi, it was a relative. By the way, let me point out, it was one of his relatives, chose to do an intermarriage. And then he was thrown out of the rabbinical assembly. So he's no longer a member of the rabbinical assembly. It was officiated at numerous interfaith marriages, and the movements of rabbinical ballot expelled him. Yep. To be sure, the conservative movement also has to pacify more traditional critics who would prefer the resolution wasn't passed at all. They worry that the decision to admit non-Jews as synagogue members will erase any meaningful differences between conservative and reform movements. I have to say, I don't think so. As I've said before, you walk in on a Friday night or a Saturday morning to a conservative or a reform synagogue, pretty quickly you know which one it is, right? I mean, yeah, there are some places where there is some overlap, but I think it's pretty clear when you walk into services, you know where you are. I think that's a safe assumption. Okay. Yet the compromise does please some. It might even bring them back to the fold. Carol, were you going to comment on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, is it possible to ask the non-Jewish partner, do you want to be a member?
An interesting question. See, but if you do that, which is an interesting question, organizationally, it's hard to have an organization that rules on a case-by-case members as opposed to having an organizational rule. There was a synagogue I once knew where basically everybody made a deal with the executive director about how much dues they paid. That was not a healthy situation. When it became apparent to the board of trustees that that was going on, they said, no, we can't. An organization, that's not a good organizational way to go, right? Although there are places, by the way, that do have voluntary dues, but that's recent. This is an organizational question. How do you do that? Might it work? I guess, but it has some pitfalls, shall we say? Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes. Rini.
this a shul or a church is not like the PTA. I mean, this is, a religious organization, a religious commitment. And I don't think, and as far as I know, the Catholic Church has certain rules about people being married on the altar or something if you're not Catholic. I mean, it seems to me that you need to make a commitment to some religious organization if you want to be a member. You don't just float in and out. So I can't imagine anybody, well, I can't imagine me, not anybody, but I can't imagine me, like wanting to go to a Catholic service if, if I didn't eventually at some point decide that was for me. So I don't really have a problem with not having non-Jewish members because this is religious. This is not a secular organization like a school board where, it doesn't matter. And even in a school board, you have to live within the school district. You can't be an outsider and be on a school board in a certain town.
Okay. And by the way, you talked about Catholic, not only can a non-Catholic and a Catholic marry, but two Catholics cannot marry in the Catholic Church unless they go through a formal process of counseling by the church.
Yeah.
It includes time with the priest, retreat. Catholic Church is very serious. Can't get divorced. So the Catholic Church realized that, we want to be serious about premarital counseling and not leave it up to chance. So by the way, that is absolutely true. And by the way, you should also know you want to become a member of certain churches. In order to become a member of certain churches, excuse me, you also have to be clear that you agree with their theological premises, right?
Right.
That you
That
are
makes
a
sense.
Lutheran and you are not an Episcopalian, and that, or you're not a Methodist, or heaven forbid, a member of the UCC. But there are specific churches that do have rules about that. You want to be a member? And by the way, but the issue of they are interested in individuals, not families, i.e., for them, it's not an issue. If one member of a couple is a Lutheran, that's fine. That Lutheran can join the church, but the other member of that family would also have to be a Lutheran. Okay. All right. But the compromise does please some. It might bring there might be others. In other words, that's the issue here. And as I've said, I've seen this. I've talked to people who are on both sides of this. There are some who say, that's fine. Here's the person, the name is Estelle Erasmus, grew up in a conservative synagogue, married a non-Jewish husband. But I don't like singing everything in English. It's been a struggle, and I prefer conservative. Okay. Now here's somebody who sees it's a great progress. Okay. As the conservative movement considers the future, most are unsure as to how big its tent should get, right? We like to think about, we have at our synagogue here in Fairlawn, people who are in favor of total egalitarianism, and we have a group that is not, right? And that was that way, by the way, when I arrived here. So the idea of a big tent, but there's an interesting question. Does the big tent have two sides? I.e., does the big tent have the side that allows for the more traditional people? But what about the less traditional people? If the theory is a big tent, should it have two sides or just one side? In every congregation, and I think I will argue that the United Synagogue was wise in saying, let's let the individual congregations make their decision. Okay. And here's someone who says, I think it depends on what day you catch me. All right. Couples married by a rabbi tend to be more likely to raise their kids Jewish. And for every Jewish person we lose, we lose. But we also don't want to dilute what we do and why we do it. And by the way, I will say again, I'll use my experience in Nashville. There were a lot more intermarried couples. There were a lot more people converting in Nashville. Hey, there weren't a lot of Jews, and in the South, that is very common. Okay. But having married outside the faith, she's still looking forward to exploring a new place within conservative Judaism now that her husband can be a member in a technical sense, i.e., not without all the abilities of a Jewish member. It feels like coming home again. So you see, they interviewed people on both sides of this issue. Some feeling, okay, this is great, and some people saying, so. All right. Let's stop it. Any comments before we go to the let's see what my next article is. Any comments? Okay. Yeah. Diane.
And as a mother of two young men, it's the whole situation is so incredibly complicated. You have birthright, which rightly so allows you to come if you have one Jewish parent. So you've got all these American kids having a great time in Israel and birthright, dating and so forth, which is great. Except there's a lot of people on the group who self-identify as Jewish because their father's Jewish, and except that they're not Jewish, right? And so are we then going to say to that young Jewish woman, now at 25 or 30 or whatever, you need to convert? I know people in Fairlawn where the mom is Catholic, the father's Jewish. She agreed to even keep the house kosher to maintain a Jewish family life, but she never agreed, to convert out of Catholicism, because that's a whole fire and brimstone issue. So, but the kids are technically not Jewish. So if you live a Jewish lifestyle, but you're not following the letter of the law, are you? So I think if it doesn't complicate your own life, it's going to definitely complicate your children or your grandchildren's life.
As you're all pointing out, there are every single different types out there. of the reality of American Jewish life. You know, you have, quote, Jewish adjacent. I've seen this phrase, Jewish adjacent people, right? They're not Jewish, but they do stuff. Or, you know, you mentioned this case of the woman who's a Catholic. Well, what if the wife is simply an atheist? And she doesn't want to convert out of atheism, right? But she wants to join, or, you know, if the kids want to be Jewish, that's fine with her. These are some of the complications, right? So I wanted to take one example. I think we may have a time for today. This is from a synagogue in Sacramento, California. Okay, I know it's California, and you can't. The rabbis never said this, but some rabbis might say something. You can't make a general rule out of something that happens in California. It sounds like something you'd get out of the Talmud, right? You know those California people. Anyway, and yes, California tends to be a bit more liberal in many issues of Jewish practice. I know. I have friends from California. Okay. Oh, welcome, Judith. Good to see you. Okay. So here's an example of a synagogue. Last month, April 10th, 2026, right? Why we changed the rules so non-Jews can be members of our synagogue. Okay, so now I have a real example from the rabbi, it's a conservative synagogue. Okay, last month, Mosaic Law Congregation in I love the name, by the way, Mosaic Law Congregation. I mean, that's, I don't know, something unusual. Changed its bylaws to be more inclusive of interfaith families and patrilineal Jews. Non-Jews in interfaith relationships are now considered full members, and patriarchal Jews may serve on the board of trustees. Now, that's pretty far, right? By the way, again, it's California. In relationships, they don't say married to, because, you know, people don't get married nowadays, and you have a lot of couples where they're in relationships. So you got to be inclusive to those people too, right? Okay. Why would a conservative synagogue make such changes, right? And again, this is an article written by the rabbi of a conservative synagogue. The process began by hearing from participants. They expressed concerns about paying full family membership dues while being excluded from formal membership and voting at congregational meetings. There we go, right? Is the issue how much you pay, or is the issue how welcome you feel? How well are those two issues tied together? They said they would feel truly included if the bylaws allowed them to become members and participate on our board. Does paying the dues cross the line into being a real member in fullest terms of that congregation? Wow. Okay. A committee drafted a proposal. There was not sufficient support for including someone who was not Jewish there was not sufficient support for including someone not Jewish to serve on our board, but there was for patriarchal Jews, those with a Jewish father but not a Jewish mother. So note they're making a finer definition here. If you have one Jewish parent, you can serve on our board. The recommended bylaw changes were presented, and they had the quorum, and 2/3, 115 people attended. Final vote was 86 to 28, an overwhelming 75% majority. Membership to non-Jews partnered with Jews. Notice they say partnered, not married, right? Okay. And allow anyone with one Jewish parent to serve on the congregational board. Now, that's a lot further than most conservative synagogues. So he's pointing out that, yes, 25% were opposed to it. Almost at this congregation, see, this is California, almost half of our young couples and families are interfaith. Wow. Okay, yeah, Rini?
Okay, I hear that part. What happens when one of their children is bar mitzvah age and the mother's not Jewish and this is a conservative shul? So you run into all kinds of issues if you open membership to non-Jews, and the non-Jewish partner might say, well, wait a minute, I'm a
Mhm.
member. But then that goes against the conservative matrilineal descent. It's complicated.
Mhm. Mhm. Uh, can you hold off 1 second here?
Sure. Sure.
My doctor is calling. Hello? Hi. The CVS or the other one, okay. Okay, that's great. Okay, great. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. You too. Bye-bye. Sorry about that. As you can, I'm keep taking these Ludens. I did go to see my doctor about this coughing I've had, and I wanted to follow up, so I apologize for that. We can go a few minutes later. Okay. No, any problem with that? Okay. All right. So here we have this question. One, is it inconsistent? Yes. Is it messy? Yes. So some people would argue that's the way Jewish religious life is nowadays. And we can either say, well, it's inconsistent and messy, and we'll just try to deal with it as we can, or we got to keep the rules 100% and not make any compromises, right? Those are your choices. This congregation, interesting, by the way, half of our young couples, almost half. You know what the intermarriage rate is for non-Orthodox Jews nowadays in America?
75%.
At least what? What did someone say? No, I didn't hear that. Okay. I think the number is somewhere around 70%
Oh, wow.
for non-Orthodox
Wow.
couples in the United States. I'm not surprised. It's very, very high. Well, come on, you all know that. Think of your families and your friends. So here's a congregation of about half, right? So do you think that had an influence on their decision? Of course it did, right? But he says, I have seen the commitment of both Jewish and non-Jewish parents in raising their children Jewish. I would argue he's not saying I would change the sentence in one way. I have seen the commitment of both Jewish and non-Jewish parents in raising their children Jewish. For those who choose to have them raised in a conservative synagogue, that is a subgroup of, people who say, oh, these intermarried families, they all raise their children Jewish. No, they don't. Many of them do. And many of them are very serious about them. But the ones who send their kids to a conservative synagogue are a bit more serious about it than some others. Okay, let's just, right. So those young people he's seeing in his own congregation, yes, they've joined a conservative, they want to, their kids and they want to be in a conservative synagogue. So I think that is already an indication of a greater seriousness. Okay. So I don't think it is indicative of the entire group of intermarried. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Being invited is wonderful, but without agency in the congregation's decision-making processes, one is not truly included. What do you think of that? Comments on that sentence. Without agency in the congregation's decision-making processes, one is not truly included. Yeah, Carol?
My attitude is if you want to be truly in every way included, then you have to convert.
Okay. Right. And I would argue that, yeah, if half of your young families are intermarried, you're probably going to be a little bit more liberal on some of these rules. That should not come as a surprise. But this is what they're saying. Now, by the way, they did not say, and I assume I don't hear this. So if that member of the board who is the patriarchal Jew could then be elected president of the congregation?
I wouldn't want a non-Jew on my board where religious decisions can be made on
Okay.
occasion.
Right. So you can conceive of a synagogue that would say, okay, you're a member, but if you're not a matriarchal Jew, if you are a patriarchal Jew or not have any Jewish parents, you're paying membership dues, but you can't be on the board. Can you be on the social action committee?
I wouldn't want them on a religious committee, a social action committee, maybe, yes.
Okay. All right. How about men's club and sisterhood? Is that okay?
If someone wants to be that participatory, why aren't they converting? I don't see non-Jews coming
Okay.
on a regular.
Okay. I would say and the answer and again, I've heard this. I know people like this is either A, I'm not a religious person. I really cannot inside of me, while I like the Jewish community and I like the processes of being a Jew and I like the culture, I'm not a religious person, and it would not be honest for me to take on a religious identity when I'm just not a religious person. I've heard that. Or I grew up as a Catholic. I'm not a practicing Catholic, but I have certain attachments that I just are part of who I am that I cannot deny. Or I have attachments in my family. If I convert, I can't tell my mother and I can't tell my grandmother. And that, by the way, I had a case like this. I can't tell my mother and I can't tell my grandmother because they would be very upset. We're living in a very difficult world, right? A very different world. So this is the way I'm just pointing out, this is the way one congregation has solved it. Other congregations might say, okay, you can be a member of a committee, but you can't chair a committee and you can't be a member of the board of trustees. By not being a member of the board of trustees, that automatically means you cannot be an officer in the synagogue, right? But there are, and I assure you, there are in the reform movement presidents of sisterhoods and or men's clubs who are either patriarchal or not Jewish at all, right? So it's a messy situation.
Rabbi, I feel differently about a patriarchal Jew. If your father was Jewish and you practiced as a child, you became a bar mitzvah, you went to Hebrew school, I'm going to treat them as Jews.
Will you want them on your board of trustees?
Yes.
Okay.
If they've lived a Jewish life publicly, yes.
And they identified as a Jew.
Yes.
But technically they're not.
Understand.
Okay.
It depends. In the conservative movement, they're not, but in the reform movement, they are. Israel, I don't know.
Right. And by this, and the conservative synagogue is allowed to make its own rules about the participation of such a person, right? That's what that decision 9 years ago said. So for some synagogues, it would be the right decision, and for some synagogues, it would be the wrong decision. Notice in that congregation, they had to have a 2/3 majority, it was 3/4 majority of those attending that congregational meeting, which is a smart rabbi who's not going to say, I'll make the decision myself. Okay. Any other comments about this issue before we end a few minutes later than we plan to? But it's not, and things are not so black and white anymore. There are just a lot of messy questions. You know, we've always said we want to be accepted as equals in our society. Well, we've accomplished that, and therefore we are finding these situations where that acceptance, as a matter of fact, there were times when intermarriage for the non-Jewish family was seen as a real negative. It's not so much anymore. Oh, you're marrying a Jew. That's great. We know Jews. They have good families and lots of good culture and lots of all this other stuff. They like their sense of humor, you know. But there was a time when it was the non-Jewish family also who would have very strong objections to that. But that has changed.
But Rabbi, do you think that someone who has a very strong commitment to Judaism would marry somebody who is not Jewish? If they're so strongly committed, maybe they would just say, well, I have to break this off. If they meet someone, because in lifestyle, it isn't going to work. Not just synagogue, but it's just a matter of having a milkshake with a hamburger. That might, be very hard. That would be hard for me,
But
particularly.
and let me say this: there are people on both sides of that question. A lot of people who marry non-Jews. I know it used to be. I don't know if it's as true as it used to be. It used to be that many Jews who intermarried would say, "I never thought I'd intermarry, but I met this person, and this person was right for me."
Oh, okay.
There are people. Yes, are there still people who would say, "No, I'm not going to even date non-Jews, or I'll break it off"? Yeah, there's still people like that, of course. But yeah, I think it's within the non-Orthodox. By the way, it happens in the Orthodox community too. Let's not pretend
Oh,
otherwise.
yeah.
But certainly not as frequently, partially because they have very strong educational institutions. It's just a matter of interaction. If you go to school your whole life, in a Jewish day school, that can make a big difference, just by the laws of interaction. Okay. Any other comments before we end this session? We'll continue a little bit more on this topic next time, just a few other little articles that I have, but it's tough. It's not an easy question. It's not an easy question. Where do you draw the line, and how do you balance that sense that we're living in a society where we want to be both welcoming and also maintain the boundaries? That's the tough part. Okay.
Thanks.
You.
You're welcome.
Thank
Everyone,
you very
Thank
much.
you.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank
have a
you.
good day. We'll see you all
Feel
next.
better.
Okay, thank you.
Hi,
Bye-bye.
Judith and